I've read a lot of your books, watched your speeches, the whole thing. I've admired you for years and years and years. So
Oh, isn't that nice?
it's really great to see you. So your book on what to eat, uh,
Mhm.
that was published in 2006, right? So it's been a
Right.
while. Right in the
Yes,
beginning.
I'm about to sign a contract for a new edition.
Oh, good. That's one of the things I wanted to ask you about is what things have changed. And
Mhm.
so right in the beginning, you expressed some admiration for Ancel Keys,
I did.
Ansel and Margaret.
Mhm.
and and he's been sort of vilified all over the internet now. Um,
Mhm.
I've read the Seven Country Study. I've talked to Henry Blackburn. I've tried to understand why he's so vilified. It seems like a
Uh,
great study. I mean, what's your perspective?
I don't know. To me, Ansel Keys is a great hero. He was an extraordinary researcher who did first rate work in a number of fields. The Seven Country Study was only one
Yeah.
of the many things that he did. He also was an expert on high altitude physiology. Oddly enough, he did a study of starvation
Hmm.
during the Second World War that is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Nobody's ever gone anywhere near it in terms of its level of detail, quality. The findings from it still hold up extremely well.
And they were so
Uh,
useful for refeeding, right? For starving.
yeah, yeah. He got conscientious objectors to agree to be starved
Yeah.
during the Second World War in order to try to find out what they had to do to refeed people who were in concentration camps and that sort of thing. And they got people who were conscientious objectors on religious grounds to do it. And the result was a two-volume study, two very thick volume study of these men. And then there have been books written in which the men were interviewed later and talked about their experience. It was a very, very difficult thing for them to do, but they all felt that they had made a really important contribution to science.
The best thing probably is the feeling afterwards that I had done something, I hesitate to use the word noble. I'd rather just use the word good.
And I think part of the difficulty about Ansel Keys was that he apparently wasn't a very nice man.
Yeah,
And
I heard he was he was pretty assertive.
people didn't like him very much. He didn't give people credit for the work that they had done. He wasn't very generous about giving credit or working with people. And so, I once asked the question, why wasn't he Nobel Prize winning? Why wasn't he extolled with fantastic awards and honors because he lived to be 100, and you would have thought that he would have been really treated magnificently in his old age, but people didn't like him very much, I guess. I met him once, but he was already very, very old, and and a little far gone by then. But the Seven Countries study was, nobody had ever done anything like that before. Was it done perfectly? No. Were there problems with it? Of course there were problems with it. There always are. But just the idea that you would do comparative studies of diet and health and come out with results that have held up pretty well, it seems absolutely remarkable to me. We're still talking about the Mediterranean diet, and that was his construct.
Well, I mean, it's been 60 years, right, since since that book. Just looking at other yourself, looking at William Lee, looking at Elizabeth Blackburn, the telomere woman who won a Nobel Prize,
Mm.
they're all recommending the Mediterranean diet all these years
Everybody
later.
Yeah, everybody recommends the Mediterranean diet. It's in the dietary guidelines as as an example of a diet that promotes as much health as a diet can promote. So he wasn't wrong about that. I think a lot of the controversy has to do with the issue of fat versus sugar, which I think is not the right. We shouldn't even be arguing about that. We should be talking about calories.
And
Um,
food, right?
and food, not sugar or fat or particular kinds of fat. But he did the best he could with it, with what he had at the time, and I think he gets a lot of he should get a lot of credit for that.
You would think. He seems to me like one of the true greats. Is it just my perception, reading through this article, the perception was that scientists back then were pretty well highly respected, more than they are now. It was kind of a cultural thing, at least in America. Is that just my perception, or?
Well, I think we're in a stage now. I mean, the internet has lowered the bar for expertise. So anybody can write about anything, anybody can be published, anybody can say anything they want, and they do. And expertise doesn't have the same level of value that it had then, because everybody is an expert.
In terms of food politics, you've commented often that the USDA is not the ideal branch of government to be suggesting nutrition policy because of their conflicts of interest. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, the Department of Agriculture was set up ostensibly to be the people's organization, but it has developed into a government agency that promotes industrial corporate agriculture, big ag, in other words, and then it has this little tiny unit in it that is responsible for dietary guidelines for the public. And those guidelines sometimes suggest eating less of the very products that the Department of Agriculture is most heavily promoting. So you have a situation in which you've got one piece of the agency that is promoting corporate agriculture, another part of the agency that's worried about food for the poor and the quality of food that is being promoted for the poor, and another tiny little agency that's doing dietary guidelines for nutrition and health. These don't always sync very well. They're not very well synchronized. And I think we need a agricultural policy that promotes health, but that's never been the purpose of the Department of Agriculture.
So you got asked this question, and I just wanted to follow up on it in a speech that you gave at UC Berkeley when someone in the audience said, Dr. Nestle, have you looked into the Canadian food guide at all? And you said, no, I don't really know too much about Canada politics. Is that still true, or where are you on that?
Well, I've actually written a couple of articles about the Canadian food guide.
I missed
so
those.
I'm not sure when that was. It must have been quite a long time ago.
Sorry about that.
Because those articles were quite a long time ago. But the Canadian food guide is better than ours in some way and not as good in other ways, and it's subject to the same kind of politics.
But it's done by Health Canada, right? And Health Canada instituted a policy where the people on the committee couldn't talk to food companies? Oh,
but they do. And food companies lobby in the same way.
I see.
But the most recent Canadian guidelines, and I'm sorry, I've just gone blank on the details of them, but it seemed to me that they were better than the American dietary guidelines in being more directly food-based. The American dietary guidelines still distinguish between guidelines for eating more, and those are food-based guidelines: eat more fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. And the minute they talk about eating less, they start talking about nutrients and switch to sugars and saturated fat and salt. And they don't talk about the foods that are the major source of those, because those are heavily processed foods. And the reasons that dietary guidelines are always controversial is because if they said what they were supposed to say, they would advise people not to eat heavily processed foods. But there's so much food industry opposition to that governments usually can't get away with it.
So it seemed to me, just reading through the McGovern Committee back in 1977, when they were wanting to say eat less meat, and the beef industry lost their minds. So the beef industry came back with this suggested statement, choose meat that has lower amounts of saturated fat. It seemed like it did what you suggested. It moved it from food into biochemistry, and it's to their great advantage to talk about biochemistry because nobody understands that. And if they want to if they want to sow confusion, just talk biochemistry and move it off of food.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that came directly from the beef industry, but it was what that McGovern committee did as a compromise, and they switched from foods to nutrients. So instead of talking about the foods that are the major sources of saturated fat, sugars, and salt in American diets, they switched to saturated fat, sugar, and salt, and we're still doing that.
That book of yours was What to Eat was a fascinating book because it wasn't what I expected it to be. I thought it was going to be, eat your kale, your turkey, whatever it was that you were going to advise. But it was so much more about the food industry and you took us along your journey. I guess Michael Pollan helped you decide to write it that way. He takes along your journey to go to the markets and explore and so on. So you talked about methyl mercury, you talked about all these, it just was fascinating and unique in the interplay of the industry with the food.
Well, I think the industry is, this is the industry that produces the food. And as I am constantly saying, the food industry is not a social service or a public health agency. These are businesses with stockholders to please. And once you understand that food companies are businesses and their primary responsibility is to produce profits for stockholders, then everything else follows from that. What to Eat was a book about food issues using supermarkets as a organizing device. So I went around the various aisles of supermarkets and talked about the issues that arose and the kinds of things you needed to know in order to make thoughtful choices about foods in supermarkets. The book came out in 2006. It's kind of out of date. Supermarkets have changed quite a bit since then. But fortunately, I'm about to start a new edition.
Yeah, a couple of the statements that you made in there, I thought, I wonder if she's going to revise that statement. Like you made one that the low-carb community was dying down in its popularity. My dog is showing up and breathing in the background. He just went out for a walk, and he's a heavy breather. So you made the comment that around 2003, the low-carb community started to sort of lose its popularity, and you said,
dear.
Yeah, and may it rest in peace, is what you said.
I wish it would rest in peace, but never mind.
Yeah, and it's now, you have Nina Teicholz. She seems to have turned into a bit of a lobbyist or something, funded by a billionaire, and she and the billionaires don't know anything about food or food policy, but they're trying to have this heavy influence. Can you comment on that, or is that too hot a topic?
I think, she reflects a point of view that high-fat diets are good for you. I'm a calorie person. I think that if you're eating a diet that's balanced in calories and you're not taking in more calories than you need, then there's a lot of leeway in the kind of diet you can eat. It can be high in fat, it can be high in carbohydrate, as long as you're eating real foods and not a lot of heavily processed foods, you're going to do fine no matter what the combination is. The Mediterranean diet is rather high in fat. The Asian diets, the traditional Asian diets, were high in carbohydrates. Both promoted optimal health because people were not exceeding the number of calories than they needed. They weren't eating too much. They were, if anything, under eating. And I'm not recommending starvation diets, but I don't think the fat versus carbohydrate issue makes very much sense. We should be eating balanced diets that have fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, and these should come from real food. Michael Pollan's Eat Food, Not Too Much, Mostly Plants really takes care of it.
I like to add one word to that. I know it's beautiful in its simplicity, 6 words, but I like to add Eat Whole Foods, Mostly Plants, Not Too Much.
Well, that's what he meant.
Yeah, I know that's what he meant.
That's what he meant. That's what he meant by food, was whole food that wasn't heavily processed. And if you do that, the proportion of fat and carbohydrate really doesn't make that much difference.
You commented in your book that one of the big problems that the sort of animal food industry has is that vegetarians live longer, or they're healthier, I think you said. Would you still say that in the modern edition or not?
Oh, absolutely. If anything, there's even more evidence that diets that don't have a lot of meat in them appear to be healthier. And people who eat a lot of vegetables, people who eat food not too much, mostly plants, are pretty healthy for the most part, on average. And and what you don't know about high meat diets is whether it's the meat itself or whether it's the dietary patterns that go along with eating a lot of meat. I mean, one of the difficulties in nutrition research is looking at single foods, let alone single nutrients like carbohydrates or fats. It doesn't really make any sense to do that because that's not how people eat. People eat diets of extraordinary variety, many different kinds of foods every day, and it differs from day to day. It differs from week to week. It differs from person to person. I mean, this is very, very hard to get a handle on. And so it's difficult to say whether it's meat itself that is a problem or whether it's that people who eat a lot of meat also tend to eat a lot of processed foods. They don't eat fruits and vegetables. They're eating too many calories. I mean, they're drinking too much. They're smoking. I mean, who knows? It's the lifestyle characteristics have an enormous effect on health and longevity too. And diet is only one factor in that, although it's a big one, I think. So trying to figure out what the ideal diet is very hard. The research is really difficult to do. Many challenging intellectual problems about how to do this kind of research and how to make sense of it.
Yeah. I heard Richard Peto say once that you can't say smoking causes lung cancer. And I thought, what? How could you not say that? And he said it's because smokers don't eat fruits and vegetables. They did identify a few who ate fruit, and he said they had a 33% lower incidence of lung cancer. And he said, but we don't have enough of them to be statistically valid, so I can't answer your question. It's like, wow, I hadn't heard that before. But
well, that's a very careful scientific answer to that question. And epidemiology can only give you associations. It can't give you causation. For causation, you have to look at the science, many different kinds of science approaching the same way. But by this time, I think we know what a healthy diet is. It's food, not too much, mostly plants. We know that. And and is there room to maneuver in that? Yes, there's lots and lots of room to maneuver. Especially, I think, if people aren't overeating calories. And I say that because 70% of Americans are considered overweight by standards of 50 years ago. And within the last 30 years, the average American has gained 20 pounds. That's an average of 300 to 500 calories a day more than people were eating 20 or 30 years ago. And we have plenty of evidence that people are eating more now. They're eating more often, they're eating in more places, they're eating larger portions, they're eating more calories. So I would say the first thing to do if you want to eat more healthfully is don't eat so much. Easier said than done.
I was just going to say that. But I mean, for me, just getting away from the processed foods, like everyone else, I eat less. Kevin Hall did a big experiment on that. I mean, they're just so addictive, the processed foods, and your taste buds change and so on. I thought your story on methyl mercury was quite fascinating in fish. Can you give a little update on that or explain a little bit about what you said way back then?
The problem is still the same. Methyl mercury is poisonous to people. It's very bad to eat it, and especially in large quantities. And it comes from two sources, from volcanic eruptions and from coal-burning power plants. Well, we can't do anything about undersea volcanic eruptions, but we can do a lot about coal burning power plants. And there's been an enormous industry lobbying effort to keep coal burning power plants going, even though they spew mercury into the environment, which gets converted into methyl mercury in the oceans. Little fish pick this up. Big fish that eat little fish pick up more and more of it. And the big predatory fish are the ones that have the highest levels of methyl mercury. And all of the federal advisories, particularly to pregnant women, are to know what kind of fish you're eating and don't eat the big predatory fish that have methyl mercury. But if you go to a supermarket and look at a supermarket fish counter, you can't tell what one fish from another. You don't know what they are. And so to put the burden of public health on pregnant women, when really what we need to do is to turn off the coal burning power plants, seems to me bad politics. It's the wrong kind of politics, and this is a situation in which coal industry lobbying has made this a problem that continues to exist, particularly because one of those big predatory fish is albacore tuna, which people eat a lot of. The other ones people don't eat that much of. But albacore tuna is something that's consumed in very large quantities by large numbers of people. And there have been cases of pregnant women having kids with, too much methyl mercury. And this would be something that we could fix if we turned off the problem at its source. I use this example as the simplest example of the public health concept of upstream and downstream interventions. A downstream intervention is one where you as an individual have to make the choice about what to do, and the burden of responsibility is on you. An upstream intervention is where you stop the problem at its source, and nobody else has to worry about it then because there's no problem.
Yeah, fascinating. So did the tuna industry somehow lobby its way around albacore tuna so that it didn't have to be any kind of regulation about it?
Well, I think everybody lobbied against it, and nobody wants their food to be regulated. Everybody.
Can you elaborate on that? I mean, does that include consumers, or are you talking about food companies?
I'm talking about food companies. Food companies don't want regulation. They do everything. And I think this is a mistake, by the way. I think regulations are good for the food industry because they create a level playing field. Everybody has to play by exactly the same rules. And you don't have to worry about doing the right thing because everybody has to do the right thing. Nobody has to go first on that. So I've always thought the food industry was making a very, very big political mistake in not fighting for stronger and more stringent regulations. For one thing, it would restore a lot of consumer distrust in the food industry. And the level playing field would be good for everybody.
So one of the questions I wanted to ask you the most, and we can end on that because I know you got to run. You wrote this book, The Unsavory Truth. That was pretty fascinating, a little bit depressing. But how do the food companies influence our perception of science?
Well, they pay for it. They fund research projects that will give them the kind of answers they want, that will demonstrate that their products help prevent chronic diseases, that will demonstrate that their products are harmless, that will demonstrate that any research that shows harm of the products is so badly flawed that you don't have to pay any attention to it. They want to cast doubt on the science that links certain kinds of foods to poor health. There's a big effort now from the processed food industry to cast doubt on research linking what are now called ultra-processed foods to poor health. These are heavily processed foods that have a lot of funny ingredients in them, industrially produced. These are the ones that are, air quote, addictive, the ones you can't stop eating. And that industry is doing everything it can to cast doubt on the research that links ultra-processed foods to poor health and poor longevity. And that kind of it's very effective. So the meat industry is putting an enormous amount of research into demonstrating that meat is good for you. And good for and not bad for the planet. I mean, any food company, the soft drink industry is famous for funding research that sugars are not harmful and that soft drinks are just fine. Soft drinks can be part of a healthy diet. Sugar can be part of a healthy diet, which is true. It just shouldn't be a very big part.
Well, well, I was an earth scientist for a very long time, and I can tell you that beef is devastating for the planet. It's like coal. It's the modern coal. So I have this hypothesis about that science question as a follow-up to that question. Anybody can write a book. Anybody can publish anything they want on the internet, more so than ever before. And the food industries have gotten bigger and more powerful and richer than ever before. They're multinational now. And so their influence machinery is really quite powerful. So you get some real scientists like yourself who are thoroughly trained, and Elizabeth Blackburn and some of the others, that we all respect. They seem to be able to rise above it. But how much does the food industry capture popular book authors and people on the internet? Do we even know?
Oh, I don't think we have any idea. I certainly don't. I mean, occasionally I hear about an example. And in my book, Unsavory Truth, which is about how the food industry influences research, particularly nutrition research, I talk about the way that food companies fund nutrition societies, for example, so that the nutrition society never says anything bad about a food product. Or they don't get involved in any kind of advice that would suggest eating less of any kind of products that are made by their sponsors. And there are many, many examples of this kind of thing. But unless you hear about an individual or some investigative reporter gets a story, you have no way of knowing. These things all take place behind closed doors. I mean, we know that in the case of the Coca-Cola company, Coca-Cola got caught. And it was a funder of something called the Global Energy Balance Network, which were a group of researchers who were arguing that physical activity is more important than what you eat or drink in how much weight you gain. Most evidence shows that what you eat is much more important in how much weight you gain than how much physical activity you do, because it's so hard to work off calories. But Coca-Cola was funding this group. The group wasn't disclosing Coca-Cola's funding. And an investigative reporter found out about it and blew the whistle on it. And it was a huge scandal. It was on the front page of the New York Times. There were stories about it for months afterwards. But unless you hear about these things or these kinds of incidents are discovered, sometimes through lawsuits, sometimes through just really clever reporting, the public doesn't know about them.
You're a national treasure. You've published so many great things, and now you got more books, at least one more book coming. I hope you'll do it for the next 100 years.
Well, thank you. The next book, by the way, is a memoir.
Oh, it is? And when's that coming out?
September 2022.
Oh, I can't wait to read that. Because I get fascinated by the history of nutrition, Sylvester Graham and, Ellen White and the whole thing, and people who've tried the carnivore diet in the past, all these different books. I've done an episode where I have 60 of these, first edition books. In fact, I have the 7-country study from 1980, in its original form. I'd buy them off eBay and I read them. I don't know why I get so fascinated in them. And I've been emailing back and forth with Henry Blackburn, who's delightful and is out traveling with his wife right now at 96. And Mediterranean diet. Mediterranean diet must be working for him and Jeremiah Stamler. Yeah. So I get really fascinated with that. So that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about, but not in this interview. Sometime we'll do another if you want.
We can do another one.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
My
Have a great
pleasure.
day. Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
you.